Welcome to the G5 having our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscape for the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review. Today, we'll be heading over to the Mountain West Conference and taking a look at the Nevada Wolfpack. They finished 3-10 in 2024 and wrapped up their 2025 spring practice with their spring game on April 11th. We have a special guest joining us today. He covers Nevada athletics and many other things over at Nevada Sports Net. He is a Home Alone stan. Hot take, is number 2 better than number 1? Only he knows. He is Chris Murray. Chris can be found on X at by Chris Murray. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And yes, I do believe Home Alone 2 is better than Home Alone 1, but those are probably my 2 favorite movies ever. You throw The Sandlot in there. It kind of shows I'm still a child, even though I'm 42 years old.
I mean, great movies. And while people are here for Nevada, they didn't know it, but they needed it today. They needed to know the Home Alone and where it goes. Before we get into the football, Chris, for those tuning into the G5 Hive for the first time, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been covering Nevada football?
Yeah, so I grew up in the northern Nevada area. Obviously, the University of Nevada is in Reno. A lot of people think it's in Vegas. It is not. I grew up about an hour south of Reno. I went to high school there, went to the University of Nevada, got my undergraduate degree, my master's degree. I started working at the local newspaper when I was 19 years old while I was still in school, and still doing this 25 years later. So now kind of more on the TV side, but, also write like 5 to 10 stories a day on our website. So been covering the Wolfpack for a long, long time. This is the low point in Nevada football during my tenure and probably really the history of the program. So a big year coming up for Nevada, coming off back-to-back 2-10, 2-10, 3-10. That's not what Nevada football has been for during my tenure covering the team or really in its entire history. So kind of sad to see where the program is right now, but 2025, second year under Jeff Choate, I think the expectations to maybe get back to a bowl and try and reestablish this Wolfpack football brand.
Well, let's move over to that football talk, and we're going to start with the offense. And while head coach Jeff Choate is entering his second season, he's going to have a new offensive coordinator in 2025. He's promoted David Gilbertson from the wide receivers quarterbacks coach. Now he's the OC quarterback coach. Prior to being at Nevada in 2024, Gilbertson spent 2023 and 2022 seasons as a co-passing game coordinator and wide receivers coach over at Akron. Prior to that, he was with Oregon for 5 seasons, 4 of which was as an offensive analyst. From what you've been able to see here, can you describe the type of offensive style that we should plan to see in Reno this season?
Yeah, I mean, they want to establish the run. You look at Jeff Choate's history when he was at Montana State, and even last year, I mean, it's probably 60% run, and they want to match that with a vertical passing attack. And you look at last year, yeah, David Gilbertson wasn't the offensive coordinator in title, but the offensive coordinator in title, Matt Lubick, who's now at Kansas, he was going through cancer. He was still battling leukemia. He was still taking chemotherapy pills. So he wasn't, I don't want to say as engaged, but it wasn't a normal situation with the offensive coordinator because health had to be first and foremost. So there were times when David Gilbertson was running practices and was calling plays and was kind of orchestrating the offense. And he's a younger guy, but he comes from a football family. His father was the head coach at Idaho and Cal and Washington. And Jeff Choate said when he promoted David Gilbertson to the role that had David kind of traded on his name and those roots a little bit more, he probably would have been in an offensive coordinator role earlier in his career. Now, this is his first time as a full-time offensive coordinator. It is first time calling plays 100%. So there's a risk in that, right? But I think what Nevada saw in him last year when he kind of was like kind of co-offensive coordinator, they really, really liked. I don't think it's going to be too different than what they did last year, though. You're going to see a lot of the quarterback running. You're going to see some of the pistol offense, at least the formation. Nevada's new running backs coach, Jim Mastro, was its old running backs coach from 2000 to 2010 before he went to UCLA, Washington State, at Oregon. Last couple of years, he had an off-the-field role with the Wolfpack because of some family concerns and issues. He couldn't fully dedicate himself. He's back in that running back role for the first time in a few years, and he helped create the pistol offense with Chris Alt back in 2005 with Nevada. So this is going to be an offense that's going to be predicated on running the ball. Their projected starting quarterback, Chuba Purdy, his probably strongest suit is being able to run the ball as well. So I think that's what you're going to look for when you're looking at Nevada's offense. Can you get 4.5, 5 yards per carry and kind of dominate the run game to set up everything you want to do with the passing attack?
You talked about the pistol, you talked about Chuba, so let's get over to the position where it all starts on offense, and that's the quarterback. Despite the record, Brendan Lewis played pretty well last season. However, Lewis is now off to Memphis, which leaves former Nebraska transfer and aforementioned Chuba Purdy, and AJ Bianco as the guys who returned, who took snaps for the team in 2024. How did the quarterbacks as a whole look in the spring?
Yeah, so Purdy, that's a very well-known last name at quarterback. That is Brock Purdy's younger brother. As you mentioned, 2 years at Nebraska. Before that, 2 years at Florida State. Now this is second year at Nevada. So 6th year at college, has not established himself as a full-time starter at any of those schools. 2 starts with the Seminoles, 2 starts with the Cornhuskers. He had 1 start last year. He is the projected starter. He was the top guy coming out of spring camp. I mentioned the athleticism. This guy is a super duper athlete. He has been banged up for a lot of his career. Even last year at Nevada, he was expected to compete for the starting job with Brendan Lewis, but he had double groin surgery, which held him out for most of the spring, had a shoulder ailment like the first practice of the fall, so kind of removed him from that competition. I think the question is can he move your offense consistently by throwing the ball? I think like 53% completion percentage in his career, more interceptions than touchdowns. I don't think there are any questions he's going to be able to run the ball. He did get that 1 start last year against Hawaii, completed more than 70% of his passes, but the offense didn't really do all that much. That was a tough game for Nevada. So he hit the transfer portal. Brendan Lewis was expected to come back, but Brendan Lewis entered the transfer portal a couple days later, eventually landed at Memphis. Jeff Choate called up Chubba and he's like, you interested in coming back? Chubba was actually joking. He was in Arizona. He had pulled his snowboard out of the attic. He hadn't snowboarded in 6 years because he didn't want to get hurt doing that, and had to put the snowboard back up in the attic because he said, I will come back to Nevada for 1 more year. He was even contemplating kind of retiring from football. So he's going to be the guy unless he gets hurt. But his history is that he's gotten hurt a lot. So that backup is important, and that's AJ Bianco. He's entering his 4th year, originally from Hawaii. I went to St. Louis High, which has developed all those great quarterbacks over the years. He's got some starts the last couple of years for Nevada, but hadn't established himself as well. So it's an open position, but I think the Wolfpack is confident that it'll be able to elevate whoever gets that job. You go back 2 years ago, Brendan Lewis had 2 touchdown passes in 11 games. And last year, to me, he was one of the best, if not the best quarterbacks in the Mountain West. He was honorable mention all Mountain West. I think the fact that the record wasn't good, didn't get first or second team, but you look at Pro Football Focus, he was one of the top rated guys in all of the West Coast. So they felt like they were able to do that from Brendan Lewis, kind of elevate him from really terrible season in 2023 to a pretty good season in 2024. And Jeff Choate even said, if Chubba had been healthy last year, it might not even have been Brendan Lewis who was starting in 2024 for the Wolfpack. So Nevada is confident in that position, but it doesn't have a guy who has been a surefire above average starter at the FBS level. So naturally, there are going to be questions.
So, Chris, you mentioned the injury concerns. You hate to label somebody as injury prone in this because not every injury is correlated to stuff, but Chubba Purdy's had injuries. And you talked about Bianco. How would you describe his game in case that we do see him this season?
He's not quite as athletic. Like AJ can move around in the pocket for sure, but he is not a Brendan Lewis level athlete. He is not a Chubba Purdy level athlete. He's a big kid. He's 6'3", 6'4". He's got a good arm. But I think the offense becomes a little bit less dynamic in the run game when AJ Bianco has to go in there compared to Chubba Purdy. Now, he might be a more advanced passer, but I think what Nevada wants to do, Chubba Purdy seems to fit that system a lot more than AJ Bianco does. But I mean, give credit to AJ. I mean, there's not a lot of guys who will stick at a school for 4 years if they don't have the starting job right out of the gates. And this guy was getting power conference offers out of high school. He had originally committed to Hawaii. They had a coaching change. Todd Graham was fired, replaced by Timmy Chang. Then he came to the Wolfpack. Obviously, things have not gone perfectly in terms of him getting on the playing field, but it seems like he really likes the community, really likes his teammates, and he's, stuck in there. Been loyal with the hope that he might be able to be the full-time starter at some point. And, Nevada opens the season at Penn State as a 43-point underdog. Like, could Chubba Purdy get hurt in that game because that's going to be pretty lopsided? Yeah, I think you're going to see both these guys play a pretty decent amount. I don't think it's just going to be one guy who starts all 12 games and is taking, 99% of the snaps.
Well, Chris, you mentioned leaning on this running game. So let's talk about the running backs. The Wolfpack will be looking to replace their top 3 running backs from 2024. Pat Garwo the second, $7 have graduated, while Savion Red's off to Sacramento State. That trio combined for 220 carries, and they'll need to go somewhere. How did the running back room look in the spring?
Yeah, I mean, Herschel Turner Jr. to me is the guy, and I think he's the breakout guy on the offense. So he was at Utah State last year as a true freshman. He played pretty well, about 450 yards. You go back to his senior season in high school out of the Bay Area, more than 3,000 rushing yards and more than 40 touchdowns in one of the most competitive divisions in Northern California. So that's the guy I think is going to step into that role and kind of take it over and be that lead back. They call it here a Nevada back. Talking with Jim Mastro, the running back coach, who coached a lot of great running backs in his first stint with the Wolfpack. He said Nevada hasn't had that Nevada back in a long time. That guy who's going to give you 20 to 25 carries, that guy that's going to not quit, that's going to keep taking punishment and just keep moving forward, and kind of be the leader of the offense. So for me, that's the guy I'm looking at. You have Caleb Ramsey. He's coming back this year. He's their top returning running back. I think he had about 120 yards last season. Previously at Morehead State, before that, Butte College, which is not too far from Reno, and Nevada's plucked a couple of players out of there. Ashton Hayes is an interesting one. So he's a local guy. He played for 2 local high schools in Reno, was committed to Nebraska, decommitted before signing day because he thought Scott Frost wasn't going to make it. Obviously, that ended up being true. Spent his first year at Cal, transferred to Nevada 2 years ago, tore his ACL that season. Last year, they actually moved him to slot wide receiver because they had some concerns there. Didn't play a lot, but now he's back at running back. So I think he also could be in the mix for carries. But I've kind of put all my chips in Herschel Turner Jr. Like, I don't know if there's fantasy college football, but I think this is a guy who can have a really big season, have 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns. And Nevada hasn't had a 1,000-yard running back since 2016. So it's been a long, long time for a program pretty well known for running the football, where they've had 1,000-yard back. If I had to pick one guy who's going to get that 1,000 yards, I'm going with Turner.
So, Chris, you mentioned Caleb and Ashton. Let's say we see them mixed in. What is it that Caleb provides? Like, how would you describe his skill sets? And same with Ashton.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's more like a one-cut and downhill kind of running back. He's going to keep it between the tackles and get some push for you. Ashton, even coming out of high school, like, he kind of viewed himself as an all-purpose guy, a guy who could play in the slot a little bit. So he's a little bit more speed than power. So a little bit different view there. And then you have Kai Wood. So he's a transfer from Texas prior to last year. He was a walk-on with the Longhorns. He got to see a little bit more, playing time as the year went along. And he's more in that Ashton Hayes mold where, you might see him in reverses, pitches, trying to get him in space. He did some kick returning for Nevada last year as well. So I think there's a variety, of running backs there. I think when you look at Turner, you're probably between the tackles. When you look at Ramsey, you're probably between the tackles. And then Hayes and Woods are more your kind of change of pace kind of backs who you just kind of want to get out in space, a little bit more scat guys.
Well, the wide receivers are going to look a heck of a lot different here in 2025. The Wolfpack graduated their leading receiver from 2024, Jaden Smith. Their number 2 wideout, Cortez Barham, is off to the portal. That's a lot of production that needs to be replaced, as both saw over 90 targets, and each of them had more than 700 yards receiving. Marcus Bellion is the familiar face in this room from a season ago. He had a tick over 500 yards receiving and 4 touchdowns last season. The staff also brought in Jordan Brown from Texas Tech and Dakota Thomas from Southern Miss. After the spring, they added another guy in Nick Rampert from North Texas. What are your expectations for this room heading into the 2025 season?
It's one of the big question marks. You mentioned the transfers. Nevada will need to get some productivity out of those guys. They're one-year guys. I think you look at Marcus Bellin, and I think he's got the potential to kind of emerge this year. He was kind of their number 3 guy. He was in the slot. Also a local kid, went to Truckee High School, which is over the state border in California, about 45 minutes away from Reno. Went to Southern Utah and then Santa Barbara Community College, then UTEP for a couple of years, and then to Nevada. So kind of a weird path for him, but everybody in the program loves him, his competitiveness. He's a smaller guy. I think you're going to see him play beyond just the slot. You might see him on the outside a little bit more. He's going to probably end up being your top target if you're Chubba Purdy. And he mentioned after a spring practice when we talked to him that his best game last year came at Hawaii, and that was the game where Brendan Lewis didn't play. So Chubba Purdy and AJ Bianco kind of split the reps in that one. So I think he's excited to work with those 2 guys. I think there are 2 really younger wide receivers on this team that really need to step up if Nevada's passing game is going to be what they believe it's going to be. And one of them is Marshawn Brown, another local kid from Reno High School, 6'4", really fast. Honestly, kind of looks like DK Metcalf out there. Maybe not quite as physical, but he's got all the skills you want in a Mountain West, if not a Power 4 wide out. The other one, Nate Burleson the second, we actually saw in that video you played before the start of the interview. That was Nate Burleson the first, who had a great career at Nevada. So Nate Burleson the second, more of a basketball player through high school, didn't have a lot of college interest in football. Obviously, the tie with the family got him over here to the Wolfpack. He's the fastest wide receiver on the team. Still kind of a basketball body, like 6'1", 6'2", maybe even 6'3", but like 165 pounds. So he's going to be more of your vertical threat. And, Nevada's base, they start 3 wide receivers. They got one in Marcus Bellin. He's going to start. Those other 2 are wide open. And I think Nevada wants those 2 young guys to win those jobs. I think ideally, if they're playing at the consistent level you need as they enter their 3rd season in the program, those guys are your 2nd and 3rd starters, and they give you, some athleticism, some ability to stretch the field. And it seems like they're really, really hungry to go out there. And this is kind of like a make or break year for them, even though they've got a couple of years eligibility after this year. If they don't break through now, maybe it doesn't happen. So it's an interesting position. I do think there's talent there, but in terms of, returning productivity, it's Marcus Bellin and not much else.
So you mentioned how this offense is going to look pretty similar and they want to run the ball. But like last year, the 2 outside guys were pretty productive, like I mentioned. So I guess that's something that fans can look forward to. Not only are we going to run the ball, but it's not going to just, targets going to one guy. It's usually both of the outside guys.
Yeah, and neither of those guys came to Nevada last year with a ton of productivity in their history. I mean, Jaden Smith was pretty good in 2022 at Tarleton State at the FCS level. He began his career at Montana State with Jeff Choate. Cortez Braham had been all over the place. He's actually currently suing the NCAA for a 7th year of eligibility, but spent 3 years in junior college, a couple years at West Virginia, and then Nevada last year. So, I think that, again, speaks to Nevada has taken, at least last year, and I know Matt Lubick is gone, and that is a big loss. They've taken guys who weren't necessarily highly productive at their previous stops and made them productive. Brandon Lewis had his best year in college. He'd been at Colorado and been at Nevada under last year's staff. Those 2 wide receivers we mentioned really broke out last year. Savion Red, their leading rusher, was at Texas before transferring to Nevada. Hadn't done much with the Longhorns. Had his best season in college with the Wolfpack last season. Tight ends, I'm sure we're going to talk about Jace Henry. He was having a really good season. He had spent 4 years at Dartmouth and been okay, but not been super productive. And last year was playing really well until he broke his foot. So I think you can look and say, well, there's not a lot of productivity coming back, and that's true. But last year they didn't have a lot of returning productivity, and they were able to, get the best out of a lot of their skill position players. And I think that's going to be the mantra again this year.
Well, you mentioned the tight ends, so let's just get right into it. If you're going to describe how the tight ends are utilized in this offense to someone who's never caught a Wolfpack game, how would you describe it?
I mean, they need to be able to block. Like we said, they want to run the football. Jace Henry, who's going to be the starter, is like 6'4", 270 pounds. So that shows you the kind of body you need to have if you're going to play tight end for the Wolfpack. And Nevada's running game really fell off after he got hurt. He broke his foot in the 4th game of the season against Minnesota, was out for the rest of the season, took that as a red shirt. Playing only those 4 games, and he's back this season. I think he's kind of like an underrated piece of the offense. He did have a couple of touchdowns and was a pretty decent red zone threat early in the season, but this guy is probably going to catch the ball 25 times, maybe 5 or 6 touchdowns, but he's there to be able to be the 6th offensive lineman. They also brought in a guy named Jet Carpenter from Eastern Washington. He's kind of your number 2 tight end, and a lot of the same stuff. Not highly productive in terms of receiving yards and catches and whatnot, but should be able to add a lot of depth to that room in terms of being able to be a big asset in the run game. So that's what they're looking at with those guys. I do think Jace Henry has some potential as a pass catcher, and he showed that last year, but those guys are there to augment what they want to do running the ball.
Now, before we exit the offensive side of the ball, I talked about how the quarterbacks run the offense, but they're nowhere without this offensive line. Chris, I'm a little bit worried about the line heading into the season. You had big losses, left tackle. We'll get to it a little bit later, but you picked this guy to be your offensive breakout player of the year last year, Isaiah World. He's off to Oregon. Left guard, Tyson Ruffins, he's off to Cal. right tackle Josiah Timoteo is off to Oregon State. Right guard Spencer Lovell graduated. That leaves center Andrew Madrigal as the anchor to this O-line in 2025. What are the expectations for this room, given that they want to run the ball so much?
Yeah, I mean, they've got to be good. And I think they did take a step forward last year. And, a couple of those guys were uncertain players entering the season. Nevada's offensive line, they call it here the Union. It's been called that since the early 1980s. You think of the Chris Alt offenses and Colin Kaepernick and why those teams were so great. It was because of the offensive line. They had 2 to 3 all-conference players on the line every single season. And it just has not been that since he resigned after 2012. That 2012 team had like 5 NFL players on the offensive line, which you don't see at the group of 5 level all that often. So they got to be able to at least approach what those old unions used to look like. You do have a 4th-year starting center coming back in Andrew Madrigal, so that's a really good feeling. Their right guard, Josh Grabowski, he started like the last 6 or 7 games last year. He was actually named their offensive lineman of the year. Isaiah World, who you mentioned, he was, according to 247 Sports, the 2nd highest rated transfer in the entire nation. So going to Oregon, getting some first round buzz, that's obviously a big loss at left tackle. What I have liked about what Nevada's done with this offensive line, it's not necessarily brought in a lot of big names, but it's brought in a lot of guys who have played a lot of football at the FCS level. So like a Jack Foster at Idaho, that guy's going to step in and be ready to play football. Hamabi Diaby from Tennessee Tech, he was a FCS All-American. He's been a 2-year starter. They're getting these guys, and I think that's what Jeff Choate really learned about his first year in Nevada, which he said he figured out the kind of guys who work with the Wolfpack. His first recruiting class, a lot of Power 4 transfers, a lot of guys who were like big recruits coming out of high school. Nevada doesn't have all the bells and whistles those guys expect. It has an okay locker room. It has an okay stadium. It doesn't have an indoor football practice facility. He's looking for guys who are going to be grateful to be at Nevada playing FBS football. And I think that's why he kind of changed the template of the guys he was looking for, going away a little bit from prima donnas, going more toward blue collar. And your offensive line has to be super blue collar. So there aren't a lot of returning starts on that offensive line. It's Madrigal and then Grabowski. But I do think that the guys that they've brought in should be able to step in and be quality players in the Mountain West. So I'm not like as concerned from the offensive line if you're kind of just looking at it from the outside. But yeah, they did lose some quality players. So there are guys you're going to have to step up and replace those guys.
And that's kudos to Choate, too, of like, hey, this isn't working. I call it failing and failing fast. Like, you don't want to just keep, okay, this didn't work, and you just keep trying to do it over and over and expecting a different result. That's the definition of insanity. So hats off to Choate with changing that up. So, Chris, let's say this union turns into this well-oiled machine, and it just crushes. You got a 1,000-yard rusher, 1,500-yard rusher. It's because who took their game to the next level on that offensive line?
That's a good question. I mean, Madrigal, you kind of know what you're going to get. I think he's like a fringe all Mountain West center, so I wouldn't necessarily point him out. Grabowski, I think, surprised a lot of people last year because he didn't kind of win the job coming out of camp and then, did kind of push forward. So I'll go with Jack Foster from Idaho. I think that's a guy who's going to start at one of the tackle positions. If it's left tackle, we obviously know how important that position is. He played really good for a really good team. Idaho is one of the best teams at the FCS level. So, he's used to like playing championship level football. Idaho beat the crud out of Nevada 2 years ago at Mackey Stadium. I think it was 30-7. So, he knows, what Nevada football is about and what he's trying to get it to be. So that's a guy who, of all the transfers on the offensive line, I'm like, yeah, that guy's probably going to be able to be a really good player in the Mountain West from day one.
All right. So last year I asked you for your offensive breakout player, and you're like, you could have gone quarterback, running back, wide receiver. You could have gone people do all the sexy names. You're like, you know what? It's going to be Isaiah World. And boy, I think you did a pretty good job in nailing that. So we got to ask you, 2025, if you have to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season, who would that be?
I'm going to go Herschel Turner Jr., the running back we already talked about. So going a little bit more sexy on this one, not going with the offensive lineman. But, I mean, this guy's stats at the high school level are just insane. And he backed it up at Utah State last year. He showed he can run in this league. Now, obviously, a lot depends on your offensive line, but I feel like it's a really good offensive line coaching staff. Brian Armstrong has been with Jeff Choate for a long time. I think the line's going to be good. Turner's a very, very strong guy. He's like only 5'9", but he can run over people and he's got speed as well. Everybody raves about his mustache over there in the locker room. So he's got all the ingredients you want to have a breakout season. So I think he hits that 1,000-yard mark. I think he's all Mountain West first or second team by the end of the year.
Well, let's move over to the defensive side of the ball before we get to the new faces on the defense. Can you describe the defensive style or scheme that they run there at Nevada?
Yeah, I mean, it's a 4-man front. It's a pretty traditional scheme. So there are defensive coordinators, Kane Ione. So he came from Boise State previous to being at Nevada, where he was co-defensive coordinator, was a great player at Montana State as well. So he's got roots back to Jeff Choate. So, nothing too fancy. They don't necessarily, blitz a ton or anything like that. And I think one of the problems last year is they did not have a lot of havoc plays. They played 13 games. They had 14 sacks. They didn't even have like a forced fumble for the first 7 or 8 games of the season. I think they ended up with 11 interceptions. So they didn't have a lot of big plays in terms of sacks, in terms of tackles for loss, in terms of takeaways. And a lot of that came down to the fact that they could not get a pass rush. And that was the big strength, they thought, entering the season on paper. They had a transfer from Cal, a transfer from Wisconsin, who were going to bookend on the defensive ends. They had Christopher Ross. He was the defensive tackle from Texas. They were really happy about their talent on the defensive front, and they weren't able to get enough of a pass rush to be able to create issues with the quarterback throwing interceptions or get strip sacks or things of that nature, or put teams behind the chains. So, I think that is the big question, is that they don't have a lot of sexy names on the defensive line. They actually only have one returning starter on the entire defense. Thomas Whitty is a former walk-on defensive tackle on the team, originally from Alaska. Kind of had an in with the Wolfpack because he was, a nephew of a former Wolfpack Hall of Fame linebacker who played in the NFL. But, I think it's a pretty base system, and they want to just execute what they're doing really, really well. Both the offense and the defense took step forwards last year, but neither of them were elite. And I think, can they get to an above average level on either side? I think the offense has a lot more returning continuity and a lot more certainty. I think the defense is the bigger question mark entering the year.
Well, you talked about Whitty, so let's talk about the defensive line. And as you mentioned, Whitty's the loaning return starter for the Wolfpack in 2025. We saw the rest of them hit the portal. You mentioned they had a hard time generating pressure last year. Well, the guys who were able to generate the pressure, those are the guys that are in the portal. So when you look at this defense, how do you think that group looked in the spring?
Well, I really like Dylan LaBarbera. So he's a transfer from Butte College. He was like a no-name entering the program last year, and you didn't see a lot of him for like the first 7 or 8 games. And then he just started to come on toward the end of the season. He got a fumble away from Ashton Genty in the Boise State game. He's definitely not your ideal size for like an edge rusher, but I think he's going to have a pretty good season. I think that's somebody who people should keep an eye on. On the other end, Jonathan Maldonado, he's like a 6'4", 6'5" guy. Now he does have all of the athleticism and measurables that you look for. And, he hasn't quite had that breakout. I think he's entering his 4th year with the Wolfpack. So I think that's somebody who has to do well. Like you mentioned, you have Thomas Whitty coming back, Nelson Ropati, another defensive tackle who got a pretty good amount of experience last year. They added a couple of transfers who are bigger guys who I think are really going to help the interior of that line. So I think the defensive tackle position is pretty well set up. I think the question is who's going to get a pass rush. They have a true freshman, Cameron Brown, who they're really, really high on. He's from Southern California. I think he might be able to provide some of that pass rush, but that to me is the biggest question on the entire probably team is, are you going to have guys who can get into the backfield from the defensive end and edge spot? If you don't have that, it's very difficult to have an above average defense. And that really isn't anybody on paper where you're like, oh, we know that guy's going to be able to get you 6 to 10 sacks. And it's even hard to project any of those guys to be able to do that. So that's the thing where you're looking at it and the depth chart and you're trying to figure out. That seems like that's the one thing that really does lack on this team is the edge pressure. But their hope is, that group kind of plays a little bit more disciplined than last year's group. There were a lot of personal fouls on last year's group from the defensive line. Christopher Ross is not on the team because of some of those issues, even though he put up big stats. Henry Ika Hihifo had a lot of issues in terms of, 15-yard penalties and whatnot. They really like Caden Johnson. He was the transfer from Wisconsin last year. Like, didn't put up crazy stats, and he had to battle through a couple of injuries, but there was stability and there was reliability in him. And I think that's what they're looking for, in the line guys this year. A little bit more stability and reliability than what they saw last season.
Well, the Wolfpack's going to see new starters at the linebacker position here this season. There were 5 guys on this roster in 2024 who took snaps at linebacker. 1's transferred, 3 have graduated. That means Stone Combs is the lone guy returning here in 2025 who saw snaps last season. We saw the staff add to this room by bringing in 4 transfers. How did the linebackers look in the spring?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Nevada's defense the last couple of years, it was Naki Matialona and it was Drew Watts, and those are your reliable middle linebackers. Those are the guys that you could really count on, and both those guys are gone. Matialona at a graduation, no more eligibility, and then Drew Watts went to Memphis along with Brendan Lewis. So, those were pretty big losses. I think Stone Combs can be a really solid middle linebacker. Like you said, he's the one returning guy with a lot of experience. I think he's got all conference potential. Austin Harnito was a walk-on at Washington. He joined Nevada last year, saw most of his playing time on special teams. He was out for spring with an injury, but I think that guy, if you envision like what does a middle linebacker look like in a football movie, it looks just like Austin Harnito, like 6'3", 240 pounds, long flowing hair, football dude. So I think he's going to get a chance. They did add Najee Logan. He came from Indiana. Didn't play a lot there last year. Before that, he was at UMass and did play a lot. So I think that's somebody who's going to get some reps. EJ Smith is a junior college transfer who was highly productive. So I think they've got some options there. They've recently added a transfer from Sac State at middle linebacker. So, I think that position is in pretty solid standing. But I think if you're looking at like one guy, Stone Combs is probably that guy. And then I'd probably say like Logan is probably the second one in terms of guys who could rise to the top of the depth chart.
Now, you talked about the defensive line needing to create pressure. If you can't get that, your defensive secondary on paper is going to look really bad. It's hard to cover somebody and run around for more than 3-5 seconds. So the secondary has its work cut out for him in 2025. You got those unknown things on the defensive line, but by way of graduation or portal, the Wolfpack sees a lot of the defensive backfield depart. That includes first-team all-conference cornerback Michael Coates Jr., who's off to West Virginia. Safety Bishop Turner is the returnee with the most experience, as he saw action in 8 games during the 2024 season. What has this stuff done to address the losses in this room?
I mean, added like 15 transfers, most of them from like bigger name schools. Yeah, the entire like secondary is gone. But last year going into the season, everyone was like, well, this secondary is not going to be any good. Like, we don't know any of these guys. And Michael Coates Jr., who hadn't played a lot, didn't even play high school football, like saw a flyer for his local junior college, walked on there, and then eventually came to Nevada. He was great last year. He's the only first-team all-conference player for Nevada last season. Like you said, leveled up to West Virginia. He got that extra year because of the junior college stint. He was a senior. They had another guy, Chad Brown, who didn't play a lot, largely a safety. They moved him to cornerback last year. He played really well. He started junior college, so he got that extra year, and he's now at Purdue. Keaton Crawford came with Jeff Choate from Texas. He played well enough at safety to get drafted, a 7th-round pick by the Cardinals. So I think they did a really good job in coaching those guys up. Their secondary coach was Kane Iona, along with Joey Thomas Jr., who oversees the cornerbacks. And it's the same challenge this year. I think there's good talent, but there's not a lot of guys who are proven. I think Bishop Turner, who you mentioned, is a guy who's going to step in, probably start at the slot nickel linebacker or nickel cornerback position. I think he had a really, really good spring camp. They were raving about him. They did bring in a couple of cornerbacks who have, pretty good experience. Ed Rambo, that's a cool name. He comes from Bowling Green. AJ Odoms, he comes from UTEP, also played at New Mexico and started in the Mountain West previously. Mervyn Kenyon, he's somebody who comes from Sac State. Before that, he was at Idaho. He's been a productive player. He's probably going to be your top safety. Hayden McDonald, they brought from Columbia, where he was an FCS All-American, wasn't with Nevada in the spring as he finished his degree. He's a cornerback who's probably going to get some, significant playing time. Cooper Wilson's a big, tall, skinny, fast cornerback from Nebraska, where he was a walk-on. So they've brought in a ton of guys at this position, And I think it's a very similar challenge to last year, which turned out pretty well given the lack of pass rush. I think the secondary held up pretty decently. And I think it's going to have to be the same story this year. They're going to have to take guys who've got some experience, but not in their scheme, and try and get the best out of those guys. But I don't necessarily think talent's a huge issue in the secondary. It's just kind of cohesion. That's the question mark here.
So, Chris, you mentioned all the transfers, and I think they had 6 that came in before the spring, was there for the spring. You had 2 after. I'm sure there's other ones that I missed. It's hard to keep track of all of them. But is there a transfer that's coming in that you're looking to him to be an impact player right away?
Yeah, I would say Mervyn Kenyon, the transfer from Sac State. So he grew up in the Bay Area. He actually wanted to play for the Wolfpack. He was on the same 7-on-7 team coached by Maurice Jones-Drew that Carson Strong was on. Carson Strong came to Nevada. He was a 2-time Mountain West Offensive Player of the Year at quarterback. And those guys were good friends. Mervyn Kenyon just never got the offer from Nevada. So he went to City College of San Francisco for a couple of years, Idaho, and then Sac State. And I think, he's always wanted to wear silver and blue, and now this is his opportunity. And he was really good for the Hornets last year. So, I think that's a guy who, at the safety position, you can probably circle and say this guy's going to come in and be an impact player. I think at cornerback, McDonald's interesting, the guy from Columbia, because he has played really, really well. We just didn't get to see him in the spring because he was finishing up his Ivy League degree. You probably don't want to, leave a semester early and put all that to waste. So
yeah.
We'll see what the jump up is. The Ivy League and the Mountain West are a little bit different levels. And then AJ Odoms, I think they're really, really high on the guy from UTEP because he had started pretty significantly at New Mexico. So you've got some proof of concept that he can play in the Mountain West. So I think there are like 4 or 5 guys you can point to and be pretty excited about. And that's not necessarily the same at some of these other question mark positions.
So I kind of just singled out the transfers. Now I want to add in the returners with it. If this secondary turns out to be a nightmare for opposing defenses in 2025, it's because who stepped up big?
Well, I think Bishop Turner, that's a guy who, has been with the program for a few years now. One of those high school guys who didn't get immediate gratification, but kept working. And now he's kind of projected to be the starter at the nickel cornerback position. So, even talking to other people in the defensive back room, it's not just the coaches who were saying really good things about Bishop Turner. It was also his teammates. So, I think he's kind of turned some heads, and, this is kind of the make or break year for him. If it doesn't happen this year, it's probably not happening kind of thing. So, I think he's in a position to win a starting job. And based on what we saw in the spring, maybe, hold down that starting job and play really well for the team.
All right. I asked you on the offensive side, so I got to ask you on the defensive side, Chris. If you had to pick a defensive player to have a breakout type season, who would that be?
I'll go Dylan LaBarbera. Junior college guys, with all these FBS transfers nowadays and FCS transfers, you kind of overlook the junior college guys and, maybe don't put a bunch of stock into them. But, he's just a guy who's going to get the most out of his talent. And you saw that toward the end of last year. Nevada had a Wisconsin transfer, a Cal transfer, a Texas transfer, and the guy from Butte College was playing as well or better than any of them. And that was his first year at the FBS level. Now that he knows exactly what this level is like, I think you're going to see him come in and probably lead Nevada in sacks, tackles for loss, forced fumbles, and be the Wolfpack's best player on the defensive line. So, probably like 6'1", 235, 240 pounds. Not necessarily how you draw it up, but I think that's a guy who, showed last year that he deserves to be at this level on scholarship, and he can be a really good player.
All right. Well, we've talked about offense. We've talked about defense. Let's move over to the special teams. How are those units looking, and do you have any concerns heading into the season?
It was bottom 10 in the nation last year if you look at ESPN's Football Power Index, so it wasn't an above-average group. There was a huge blunder they made against SMU that cost them that game. Nevada was a 25-point underdog and was winning by 9 with less than 10 minutes to go, and kind of took the ball out of the end zone and then kind of tried to go back in and ended up having a turnover there. A game against Colorado State, they had a huge mistake on a kick return that led to directly a touchdown. That probably cost them that game. So special teams were not good for Nevada last year. And for Jeff Choate, that's a problem because Jeff Choate kind of came up in this business as a special teams coordinator. That's what he was doing at Boise State, back when Chris Peterson was running that program. And wasn't a good group. Their special teams coordinator, Parker Henry, is back. So he'll get another chance to try and get that group in a better position. They don't have a kicker on the roster who's kicked an FBS field goal. They don't have a punter on the roster who's punted at the FBS level. They don't have a long snapper on the roster who has FBS experience. So that's not necessarily ideal. There's going to be breaking in some new guys there. They did get a transfer kicker from Western Oregon. They did get an Australian rules rugby punter onto the roster. I think the return game should be pretty good, though. Marcus Bellin, that wide receiver we talked about, he had like 6 kick returns for touchdowns when he was at the junior college level. And then at UTEP, he was an all-conference player as a returner and had some touchdowns and some big returns there. He's the punt returner. He didn't do kick return last year, so I'll be interested to see if he weaves into that. You look at kick returner, a guy named Marquise Ashley, Charles Brown, Kai Woods, they all have experience. So I think the return units will be all right. I just think, the punt game wasn't very good last year. The guy who was doing the punts, Guy Gillespie, no longer with the program, even though he had returning eligibility. So I think that the punt game has to be a lot better. And then, we'll see at kicker because they did lose their starting kicker to graduation. And, they don't have anybody that you're going to be like, oh, that guy's going to plug in because he's been here and we know he can make kicks.
Do you think that forces or lends maybe 4th and short, 4th and 3, that we're going for it a little bit more? I mean, I know field position depends on it, but do you think we've seen go for it more this year?
Yeah, and Jeff Choate's already pretty aggressive to start with. There was a game against San Jose State last year where Nevada lost at the very end, and they were 2-6 in one-score games. I mean, that's why they went 3-10. They were a much better outfit last year than the previous 2 years, even though the record wasn't that dissimilar. There was a chance to go for it on 4th and short, and he didn't. And he immediately said he regretted that. And he was pretty aggressive to start with. But when you don't have a lot of margin for error and you're not going to just out-talent people on the roster, you got to take some risks. And given what the special teams were last year, I could see them taking more risks on, 4th and 4 and below. And when you have an athletic quarterback, if Chuba Purdy does have the job, that lends itself to trying to go for it more on 4th down situations. So, yeah, I would think Nevada's at the top of the Mountain West and, going for it on 4th downs this season.
And something you mentioned how they were in those one-score games. I mean, it's an odd-shaped football. It bounces different ways this year, that year. But you think about it, week 1, SMU, they go to the playoffs, and you talked about, leading there in like the third quarter, but like I'm trying to remember the halftime score of that game, but like it was like, I mean, granted it was a little sloppy game maybe there at the beginning, but like at halftime it was like, whoa, this game's a lot closer than you anticipated. And then at the end you see this team go to the playoffs. Like that's gonna give the Wolfpack some confidence heading into the season.
And they went to Boise State and they only lost by a touchdown in a game where Sean Dollars had 3 fumbles, including on the 1-yard line. And that team gets to the quarterfinals of the playoffs. So
yeah,
Nevada showed last year, like, it can do this. It just couldn't close games. And a lot of that was penalties, the undisciplined play that we talked about. A lot of it, the offense didn't execute on final score drives. And, you get opportunities with the ball with 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes to go. You got to take advantage of them. I think the lack of being able to take the ball away on defense kind of hurt. And Nevada didn't turn it over a lot. It just didn't give itself additional possessions. But that's the formula. The formula is run the ball really well, shrink the game to 9 or 10 possessions, get a couple of turnovers, beat the team on special teams. So they got like some of that formula right last year. I think they were able to shrink the game. I think they were able to run the ball pretty well, certainly better than, the last couple of seasons before Jeff Choate got here. They just didn't have enough turnovers. They just didn't execute quite well enough in the fourth quarter, but they should have beat SMU. They should have beat San Jose State. I don't know if they should have beat Boise State, but they made Boise State look pretty bad. Boise State just had Ashton Genty, and the Wolfpack couldn't stop them. They should have beat Georgia Southern for sure. That was a game they had in the bag. They fumbled inside the 10-yard line going in to win the game. So there's a very real chance Nevada won 6 or 7 games last year if it just cleans some stuff up in the fourth quarter. And I think that's where the positivity for this program comes, is that the record wasn't good, but the quality of play on the field was better, and now you're under year 2 at Jeff Choate, and the schedule is easier. I'm not saying it's an easy schedule. You do start at Penn State, and you do have Western Kentucky on the road in non-conference, and you do have to play Boise State and UNLV and Fresno State. But last year's schedule was Nevada's hardest in the FBS era, and the Wolfpack joined the FBS in 1992. So it was a difficult schedule where Nevada played a lot of good teams close. but couldn't win those outside of the one against Oregon State. So we'll see with a little bit lighter schedule. The non-conference games, the harder ones are on the road. That's going to be tough. But in conference, the tough games are at home and the easier games are on the road, which is what you want. So there's a pathway for 6 or 7 wins and getting back to a bowl. I know, you look at the betting odds, it's 4.5. You look at ESPN's Football Power Index, they've got them at like 4.2 wins, a 22% chance of making a bowl. I think that's underrating what the Wolfpack could potentially do, despite some of the concerns I have with the roster.
Well, I before we move on to the next section, I can just hear people, they're listening to it and they're like, Luke, Nevada played SMU week 0. I said week 1. I'm sorry. I get confused with the whole week 0 thing. Sorry. Okay, now that I got that covered. Now that spring practice is over, which position group or groups do you think is the most concerning heading into 2025?
I'm going to go defensive line and those edge rushers. I think that's the position that I have the most concerns of, just in terms of talent. There are positions on the team that don't have a lot of returning productivity, but you look at the talent, you kind of figure that they're going to figure it out. So, it's hard to get really elite pass rushers at the Mountain West level. They're not very plentiful. Boise State usually has most of them too, and Fresno State. So that's why they're really good. So that to me is probably the position I have the most concerns about. In terms of the offense, I would say wide receiver, just because they are banking on some young guys who haven't quite done it yet. You look at the running back room, it's not like they've got a lot of returning productivity, but I just feel like with the scheme that they run and with Herschel Turner, I think they'll be okay. But will they have those like game-changing wide receivers that we saw last year with Jaden Smith, with Cortez Braham? Yeah, those guys hadn't had a lot of productivity, but they were like 6'2" to 6'4", and you could just see in practice like they were going to be a problem for people. And I think Nevada isn't quite there in terms of what I saw in the spring, where you're like, Marcus Bellin, I think, is good, and I think Jace Henry's good, but those are more possession guys. Do they have guys who are going to get the ball down the field and, give defensive coordinators nightmares the day going into the game? Because, like, how are we going to stop this guy, and how are we going to have to double team him? There's not a guy on Nevada's, pass catching core where you're like, oh yeah, we got to double team this guy or roll the defense toward him.
Well, in today's age of NIL revenue sharing, that just happened here, a few days ago, the transfer portal, how has it changed Nevada's recruiting philosophy? Now, I know it's Coach Choate's second year, so what have you seen there?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a robust budget. We obviously don't know NIL levels. When you talk about revenue sharing, Nevada's committed to doing that, about $5 million for all of its sports combined. But, men's basketball here, led by Steve Alford, gets the majority of the NIL money, and it'll be interesting to see how the revenue share goes. They haven't really said how they're going to split it up, but I think they want to get back to the high school roots, and that's something that Jeff Choate didn't really get a chance to do in his first recruiting class because he got the job late. Class was already kind of signed. They only had a handful of prep guys. This year's prep class, 25 to 30 kids. They want to be able to develop guys from the ground level. That's what he did at Montana State. They're not going to go out and get you a $150,000, $200,000 quarterback. That's not Nevada. Isaiah World, who you mentioned, the offensive lineman who went to Oregon, he's probably making more in NIL than Nevada's entire team this season. So that's not going to be how the Wolfpack wins games, through revenue sharing and through NIL. That's not going to be how they procure talent. They're going to have to do it with the high school kids. And like I mentioned earlier, Jeff Choate feels like he has a more clear understanding of the kind of player who's going to be most successful at Nevada. And that is a 3-star guy with a couple of FBS offers, but mostly FCS interest, who's disciplined, who's going to be hardworking, who loves football. And that's how Chris Ault did it back in the day. I mean, Chris Ault's in the College Football Hall of Fame, won 233 games, not because he was getting high-level guys. Colin Kaepernick had one FBS offer. Joel Bitonio, who's in the NFL, might be going to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, had a couple of FBS offers. It was between Nevada and San Jose State. Nate Burleson wasn't getting a ton of crazy offers. Brandon Marshall, who won a Super Bowl with the Broncos, had to recruit himself to Nevada out of Las Vegas. Virgil Green, who played a decade in the NFL, and he's currently Nevada's tight ends coach, won a Super Bowl with the Broncos. Not a highly regarded guy coming out of Tulare and the San Joaquin Valley. So I think it's getting back to that Alt formula. The problem is Alt didn't have to, I developed Colin Kaepernick, now he's going to leave. So you're going to have to keep it rolling year after year, because if you are doing a good job in developing under the radar guys, you're going to end up losing them. And I think Jeff Choate, he's a really charismatic, personable, genuine guy who's fun to be around. I think Nevada's going to have a fighting chance to keep some of these players, even if they have bigger offers elsewhere, because of the kind of person he is and how he invests in the players. But that is going to be a challenge for any Group of Five school.
So you talked about, wanting to secure those high school players. It seems like the P4 is just, all right, who is the first team all conference guy? Okay, we're going to take him. We're going to take him. We're going to get Isaiah. They're just plucking mainly from the G5 is at least what it seems like. And if people don't know it, there's some great football around the Nevada area, and you're close to California. You've kind of seen prospects leave the state of California because USC hasn't been maybe recruiting as well. Maybe that changes this year a little bit. But do you feel like because P4s are looking more at the G5 schools to pluck that talent, that Nevada actually has higher rated recruits available to them to scout and convince to come to the Wolfpack?
Yeah, and I think you look at kind of the dismantling of the Pac-12. There are kids who just want to play mostly on the West Coast. So maybe the Mountain West becomes a little bit more attractive in places like Nevada because they don't want to be flying like halfway across the country all the time. So, Jeff Choate actually said, so he was at Boise State for a long time when Chris Hall was here at Nevada. And he said that he always looked at Nevada and was a little bit envious of its location because of how close it was to California. Boise is obviously a great football program, but it's a lot further away from Los Angeles, Sacramento, and San Francisco than Reno is. I mean, Reno is 2 hours to Sacramento. It's 3.5 to San Francisco. It's an hour flight down to LA. And those are the areas he's looking at to try and build this roster. He wants the Northern Nevada guys, some Vegas guys, and he wants people from California because he thinks that he can, build a really good roster based on those guys. So I think he loves the location of Nevada. Obviously, he's got roots up in the kind of the Pacific Northwest. He was at Washington State, Washington, Boise State, but he comes from small town Montana, so you've seen them go after some Montana guys a little bit more as well. I think he's happy with what Nevada can offer to those kinds of guys. It's not going to be very often the Wolfpack signs a 4-star guy out of high school. That's just what the reality is, and it's always been that way. But Nevada still made 14 bowls in 17 seasons with some of those limitations in terms of what it can do in terms of high school recruits. So, just getting this program back to being a bowl caliber team year in and year out is the first goal. That has to be accomplished. Nevada athletics' future hinges on football being more competent than it's been the last couple of years. Men's basketball is a very good program, and it does create revenue, but Nevada football has been losing $3 to $4 million a year the last 3 or 4 years, and that does not work in college athletics. Your football program cannot be losing lots of money if you're going to be a successful athletic department. So that is Jeff Choate's challenge. Year one, he said it wasn't going to be a rebuild. It was going to be a launch. He wanted to have the most improved win total in the FBS. They went from 2 to 3, so they didn't accomplish that. But if you look at, margin of difference in terms of point differential, if you look at advanced metrics, offense and defense, they were a much better team. They did take a step forward. It just wasn't super reflected in the win-loss total. And for me, if 2025 is going to be a success, they have to get to a bowl. Anything less than a bowl is not a successful 2025. And then you look at the new era of the Mountain West after this season with San Diego State and Boise State and Fresno State and Utah State and Colorado State going to the Pac-12. All of a sudden, you're looking in the conference and, okay, all you got to do is beat UNLV, Air Force, and Northern Illinois, and you're probably going to win the Mountain West title. That seems like a much more realistic goal than where Nevada is currently.
So I asked you earlier on what was your main concern. What do you think the team's main strength heading into 2025?
I think it's going to be the ability to run the ball. I really like the coaching staff on that side. Their offensive line coach, Brian Armstrong, and he's assisted by Mike Lynch, who used to be the offensive coordinator at Syracuse. Those are two really good coaches. I think Jim Mastro coming back and running back coach going to mean a lot. I think Jeff Choate knows how to build teams that can run the football. If you look at his history, David Gilbertson as the offensive coordinator is a little bit of a question mark, but I have said a number of times I like Herschel Turner. I think if Chubba Purdy stays healthy, he is an electric athlete. It's funny to say, but Nevada plays a charity softball game against like the fire department and police and wildlife services. So they did that last year at the AAA ballpark here in Reno, and just Chubba Purdy playing softball, you were like, oh my God, like this guy is an elite athlete, like just chasing down balls in center field and running the bases. So I think Nevada is going to really be able to run the ball this season. Yes, that offensive line has some question marks, but if it comes along and just gives them a chance, I think that's going to be really successful. And that's really where the entire, I think, program starts with, is that offensive line and being able to run the ball. So I would say that's probably the area that I'm probably most convinced in, which is a little bit surprising if you just looked at the returning players. But I think Nevada is going to be one of the better running teams in the conference.
And you talked about success for the Wolfpack in 2025 being that 6-6, get to a bowl game. We talked about the schedule earlier. Is there a point in that schedule that you're like, this is the make or break point in that schedule?
Well, I think it's the home games against the better teams. I mean, I think you get Boise State and you get UNLV at home, and those are Nevada's two big rivals. If the Wolfpack can win, I mean, it would want to win both those games, but at least one of them. I think this team just needs to send a signal to the community, like we're back. Like, this is something to get excited about. Like, Mackey Stadium has been a mausoleum, and you're always fighting, cold winters in northern Nevada and late kickoff times. But it felt like that SMU game last year was going to be right off the bat. Like, we're back. Like, hey, we just won as a 25-point underdog against a top 25 team that's supposed to compete in the ACC. And they just never quite had that breakthrough. Like, they beat Oregon State, and that was kind of good. But then they lost their last 6 games. I just think they need a statement to the community that, Nevada football is cool again. Like, it's fun to come out to the games, because so much of the attention and focus here goes to men's basketball, and it's really become a men's basketball town the last 15 to 20 years. They just need that game where they go and they beat a really good team. And nobody expects that's going to be Penn State to open the season. That's difficult. You're going to get $1.4 million, and that's why you're playing that game. But I think if they could beat one of those two big rivals at home, which should be pretty good crowds, I think that would mean a lot to the, return of Nevada football to the standard that so many people expect it to be at.
Well, Chris, we've covered a lot. Is there anything else that you want to share? I think that we should know about this 2025 Nevada Wolfpack football team.
I think we hit it. I mean, Jeff Choate is a great quote. So if you visit our website, you'll probably see some cool quotes over the year. If you tune into the games, I think they've got 9 on national television. You'll see some good stuff from him. It's funny because like on the sidelines, he's pretty reserved, and he kind of says that's the day for the players to be in the spotlight, and I don't want to the camera's on me because I'm going crazy over there. But on like a day in day out basis, he's a fun guy to be around. I think he really fits Nevada's program. He's blue collar as well. Grew up in small town Idaho. Played at a Division II school. Was a high school AD and coach for 9 years before going and being a graduate assistant. He was almost 30 years old at Utah State to really begin his college journey. So he's got a really interesting path, and I think he is really committed to making Nevada a football town again. And that's not going to be something that's easily done, but this guy really wants to get it accomplished, and it'll be fun to see if he can get it done. But press conferences with Jeff Choate are entertaining, and as a kind of beat reporter, that's fun to see.
All right, Chris, thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to spend with us and share your knowledge. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, if you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. If you're listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. Until the next time, we are the G5 Hive.